Mark Bowers was a tired husband craving excitement. Linda Bowers, his emotionally distant wife, longed to feel alive again. Their home was a modest two-story house with a white picket fence and a slightly overgrown garden. They smiled when required, laughed at the right times, and played their roles well. The young couple was freshly married, energetic, and full of charm. Jason jogged past and stopped to chat, introducing himself and mentioning how he and Emily were still settling in. A few days later, Emily rang the Bowers' doorbell with a homemade pie and an invitation to their housewarming barbecue. Linda, always polite, accepted. Jason had a magnetic personality, always wearing sleeveless gym shirts that revealed his toned physique. Jason admired Mark's career experience and asked for advice on starting a small business. They started playing board games, swimming in each other's pools, and sharing bottles of wine long after the sun had gone down. That night was the turning point. From that moment, there was no going back. Their eyes said more than words could. They began meeting separately, sometimes even under each other's roofs. Emily would find excuses to visit Mark during Linda's errands. Jason began showing up at Linda's gym class. Text messages flew back and forth, encrypted with subtle emojis and vague phrases. They believed they were in control. They believed it was just physical. The air became charged with possibilities. The lines between friendship and intimacy began to blur. The age difference seemed to vanish when they were together. Mark began to feel seen again. He hadn't felt that kind of attention in decades. And once the fall began, there would be no stopping the descent. Emily hung on to his every word, told him he was brilliant, made him feel desired. He started taking better care of himself, dressing better, working out again. Linda, too, was swept up in the thrill of Jason's youth. His compliments felt like an antidote to years of feeling invisible. She laughed at his jokes, let herself be vulnerable, let herself feel beautiful again. Emily's playful attention reignited a part of him he thought had long died. Emily seemed to genuinely enjoy her time with Mark. Her eyes lit up in a way they never did with Jason. Jason noticed. At first he joked about it. But soon his laughter turned into long stares and quiet observations. He began to track patterns, who was where and when. He started keeping tabs on Linda too, though she was more discreet. Linda found herself laughing more, especially at Jason's light-hearted teasing and flirtatious remarks. Trust began to erode. Jealousy crept in, silent and sharp. The arrangement had no boundaries, and now it had no rules. Linda told Mark she was going to a book club, but her phone pinged from Jason's house. Mark didn't confront her. He just watched. Emily told Jason she was working late, but Jason had installed a tracking app on her phone months earlier. Each person was caught in a web of desire, confusion, and ego. Emily seemed genuinely interested in Linda's stories from her years of teaching. Mark noticed how Emily often looked at him when Jason wasn't watching. Linda saw how Jason always pulled her chair out for her or poured her wine without asking. The glances were subtle at first, the compliments harmless. But beneath the surface something was brewing. Emily, with her striking green eyes and infectious laugh, carried herself with a quiet confidence. They stood out immediately among the older, slower-paced residents. Their arrival sparked whispers and curiosity. But they both knew something was missing. They had stopped asking what that was years ago, choosing comfort over confrontation. No one said anything about it, but everyone felt it. Then came the night they played a game of truth or dare, half-jokingly. The questions became increasingly personal, the dares more daring. The game ended abruptly when Mark dared Emily to kiss him on the cheek. She didn't hesitate. Linda and Jason watched, neither one stopping it. For over 30 years, their lives followed a steady, predictable rhythm. Mark worked in corporate accounting while Linda taught at a local elementary school. They had raised 2 kids who had since moved away, leaving the house quieter than ever. On paper, their life looked complete. But behind closed doors, the silence was loud. The love they once shared had faded into routine. Conversations had turned into reminders. Affection had been replaced by obligation. They still slept in the same bed, but the emotional distance between them was undeniable. Jason Reyes, the charming young neighbor, hid a dangerous obsession. Emily Reyes, his curious wife, crossed lines she could never uncross. What began as a thrilling partner swap between 2 mismatched couples spiraled into surveillance. betrayal, and a chilling murder that no one saw coming until it was far too late. Mark and Linda Bowers had spent most of their lives in the same Indiana suburb. Their weekends were filled with small-town activities, community picnics, church gatherings, and the occasional dinner with other couples from the neighborhood. Everything changed the day Jason and Emily Reyes moved into the neighborhood. Mark first met them while trimming the hedges in his front yard. That first gathering brought the two couples closer. They found more in common than expected. Over the next few weeks, the couples began seeing each other more. Dinners turned into late-night hangouts. One evening, while Linda and Jason were in the kitchen preparing snacks, Mark and Emily stayed outside by the pool. It started with physical contact disguised as accidents. A touch on the shoulder, a hand brushing past another, lingering a bit too long. They pretended it was all in good fun. But after that, everything changed. Soon, the couples entered a silent agreement, one with no rules, no promises, and no protection from what could go wrong. But nothing stays casual for long when hearts get involved. Mark started to feel alive again. But for Jason and Emily, things were more complex. What was meant to be liberating slowly started to rot from the inside. And then came the first lie, small, but noticeable. It was no longer a harmless game. It had become a high-stakes dance, each step bringing them closer to a dangerous edge. None of them knew it yet, but someone would soon fall off. The secret arrangement between the Bowers and the Reyes had taken on a life of its own. What began as a thrilling escape from routine now pulsed with tension and imbalance. Each encounter, each secret meeting, added more weight to the emotional chaos building behind smiles and closed doors. At first, they all believed they could handle it. They convinced themselves it was fun, that they were mature enough to separate feelings from flesh. But that illusion didn't last. Jason began to change. He became more possessive, especially toward Linda. What had once been flirty curiosity turned into obsession. She didn't reveal everything, and he didn't press her. They were too far into their separate entanglements to truly communicate anymore. Mark chalked it up to paranoia, the result of their unconventional arrangement, and returned his focus to Emily, who now seemed to occupy his every thought. But inside he was seething. He started texting her at all hours, showing up unannounced at places he knew she frequented. He stayed up late, obsessively watching old videos and pictures of the group's gatherings. Instead, she packed a bag and went to stay at a nearby hotel, hoping that time and distance would diffuse whatever darkness had crept into her life. And something told her he might do something he couldn't take back. She suggested to Mark that they leave town for a few days, maybe take a short trip. Mark hesitated, worried about appearances, about Linda, about their neighbors. Emily dropped it but grew more anxious by the day. But Jason had already noticed her absence. He began driving by the Bowers' house, knocking on the door when he thought she might return. He called her repeatedly from unknown numbers, left voicemails that grew increasingly erratic. She hadn't told anyone. She walked into her house just before sunrise, locked the door, and went upstairs to shower. She didn't notice the faint sound of a creaking floorboard in the hallway. She didn't see the closet door that hadn't fully latched. She didn't know she wasn't alone. He pored over every detail, analyzing glances and body language. He became convinced that Emily was planning to leave him and take Mark with her. This wasn't a game to him anymore. He felt betrayed, abandoned, and angry. Linda, initially flattered, quickly grew uncomfortable. She felt watched, as if her privacy no longer belonged to her. Linda's car was in the garage, her shoes by the door, but the house was silent. Her suitcase was open, half unpacked, and one of the bedroom windows was unlocked, but Linda was gone. He walked from room to room, calling out for her, but there was no response. He installed hidden cameras in his home living room, kitchen, guest bathroom, even the hallway facing the bedroom. He claimed it was for security, but the footage he saved had nothing to do with burglars. She began pulling away from the group, declining invites, staying late at work, reconnecting with old friends. She didn't tell Mark exactly why, but she hinted that she needed space. She had started to see how far they'd all drifted from their original lives, how distorted their intentions had become. She missed who she used to be. He started using Emily's laptop when she was out, logging into her emails, reading her messages. He found a thread between Emily and their sister that mentioned Mark in a way that confirmed his worst fear. Emily wanted to end her marriage. She started going through his mail, checking his computer when he was in the shower, asking questions about his finances and assets. Mark noticed but didn't confront her. He believed she was just being curious, maybe even imagining a future with him. He wanted to believe it was love. At first, she tried to put space between them, hoping the attention would fade. One evening, Linda received an anonymous envelope in her mailbox. Inside were printed photographs, grainy, low-quality images that had clearly been taken without her knowledge. One showed her entering her gym. Another showed her through the window of her kitchen, sitting at the table. The final one chilled her the most. It was her asleep in bed, the photo clearly taken from inside her house. But the more she pulled away, the closer Jason seemed to get. He began asking probing questions, trying to figure out where she was going, who she was seeing, and when she'd be home. Emily, meanwhile, became deeply involved with Mark. What had started as a playful affair soon grew more complicated. Emily confided in Mark not just about Jason, but about her childhood, her insecurities, her fears. She began sleeping over more frequently, spending less and less time in her own home. Mark didn't protest. In fact, he welcomed it. After years of emotional distance with Linda, the presence of someone who hung on his words and wanted to be near him was addictive. He didn't see the warning signs, or maybe he did and chose to ignore them. Emily wasn't just falling for Mark, she was changing. Linda, growing more suspicious of Jason, started locking her bedroom door at night and checking behind her when walking to her car. She began noticing odd things. Her kitchen chairs moved slightly, her bedroom blinds left half open, her perfume bottle misplaced. Then came the most unsettling moment. One afternoon she returned home early and found her back door unlocked. Nothing was missing, but the light in her closet was on. Linda stood there, frozen. The sense of violation was undeniable. She told Mark about her concerns, though vaguely. Jason, sensing that Emily had emotionally drifted toward Mark, began unraveling. Jason began taking more drastic steps. When Jason confronted her, Emily denied everything. She played innocent, insisted it was just harmless fun, that she still loved him. Jason pretended to believe her. Meanwhile, Linda decided to distance herself from the situation, but distancing herself didn't keep her safe. She didn't call the police. She didn't tell Mark. Emily, now essentially living with Mark, pretended to know nothing. But she was growing uneasy. She had seen a change in Jason's eyes. He was slipping. Then came the night when everything began to fall apart. Linda, still staying at the hotel, checked out early one morning and returned home quietly. Hours later, Mark returned from a morning walk and noticed something odd. The bathroom door was ajar. The shower was cold. A towel lay crumpled on the floor. She had simply vanished. The neighborhood awoke to an unsettling quiet. By mid-morning, word began to spread that Linda Bowers was missing. Mark tried to keep his composure, but his pacing, phone calls, and repeated checking of the front door betrayed his panic. Her personal items were still in the house purse on the kitchen table, car keys in the bowl by the door, phone turned off in the bedroom drawer. The towel in the upstairs bathroom was still damp. A mug of half-drunk tea sat on the counter. Everything felt frozen, like she had stepped out for a moment and never returned. He told the neighbors that Linda had returned from a short trip, then suddenly disappeared. Didn't he mention their recent marital strain or the odd arrangement they had with Jason and Emily? But a few were more intrusive. One in the hallway ceiling facing the guest bedroom. Another pointed directly at the living room sofa. She had noticed how paranoid Jason had become in recent weeks, but hadn't he imagined he was capable of doing something serious? His laptop was filled with folders labeled by initials LB, MR, Inside were screenshots of text messages, photographs, and surveillance clips. It became clear Jason had been watching all three of them for months. Still, there were signs she could no longer ignore. A few nights earlier, she had caught him standing outside Mark and Linda's house, staring through the kitchen window. This time, he asked for a lawyer. He denied any wrongdoing, said he loved Linda, and that he believed she might have just run off due to stress. But the detectives weren't buying it. The evidence was piling up, and Jason was sinking fast. When she confronted him, he claimed he was just walking, but something in his voice unsettled her. Neighbors whispered about the strange double couple, the secrets no one had known. Around 3:45 a.m., his camera had captured Jason's distinctive black SUV parked off a desolate rural road near an old rest stop 2 hours from the city. The timestamp matched the missing hours in Jason's alibi. The quiet neighborhood had become a crime scene wrapped in scandal. He showed no emotion as he was taken away in handcuffs, only turning once to glance back at his house expressionless. The front yard of the Bowers home filled with withered flowers and sympathy cards. The area was overgrown and remote, surrounded by tall grass and scattered trash. No one in the neighborhood looked at each other the same way again. The lines between trust and betrayal, intimacy and danger, had been shattered beyond repair. Cadaver dogs were brought in. After hours of searching, the dogs alerted near a shallow depression in the earth. A few feet beneath the surface, partially covered in leaves and plastic, was a body wrapped in a hotel blanket. She confessed to the nature of their relationship with the Bowers. She described the partner swapping, the emotional entanglements, and Jason's growing obsession with Linda. She told the detectives about Jason's increasing aggression, his stalking, and the time she found a box in their garage containing women's clothing, including a silk robe identical to one Linda owned. After Linda disappeared, she started checking her car twice before getting in. She stopped sleeping without a light on. Fibers on one of the garments matched those found in the Bowers' guest bedroom. Even more damning, a single blonde hair matching Linda's DNA was discovered on Jason's jacket, tucked in the sleeve lining. And now, with police involved, the fear that had been gnawing at her became impossible to push down. When asked why he needed so many cameras, Jason said he was worried about home security. Investigators seized the equipment and began reviewing the footage. He admitted they had been going through things, but denied any serious conflict. He was cooperative, perhaps too much so. He allowed a full search of the house, answered every question, and offered his phone and email records. But when the detectives asked about Jason and Emily, his answers turned vague. She moved cautiously, glancing toward the living room window. A shadow passed behind her, brief, almost undetectable. Then the footage cut out. Another showed her locking the front door, followed by Jason's car slowly pulling up minutes later. In another, taken days before her disappearance, Linda was sitting on the porch, visibly tense. Jason's voice could be heard off camera, asking questions. Her responses were muffled but sounded short and uneasy. He didn't mention the swapping. He said they were just friendly neighbors. He only said that her car was still there, but she was gone. Detectives arrived by noon. They found no signs of forced entry or violence. Jason hesitated but eventually agreed. What they found set off alarms. They canvassed the area, asked neighbors if they had seen anything. Most said no. One mentioned seeing Jason Reyes' car slowly cruising down the street around dawn, but no one thought much of it at the time. The officers took notes and promised to follow up. When detectives knocked on his door, he answered in a shirt damp with sweat. His hands shook slightly, his eyes darting around as he spoke. He claimed he hadn't seen Linda in days. When asked if he'd been in the area that morning, he said no, then quickly changed his answer to, "I might have gone out for coffee." His contradictions piled up fast. Mark insisted he had no idea where Linda went. Jason, on the other hand, wasn't as calm. The police grew suspicious and requested to search his home. Several hidden cameras were installed throughout the house. Most were in typical places: entryways, garage, porch. Meanwhile, Emily, now practically living with Mark, started to panic. When detectives returned with a search warrant for Jason's devices, they uncovered more troubling details. One file contained clips of Linda walking through her house, unaware of the hidden camera capturing her every move. But the most alarming footage was from the night she vanished. Around 3:12 a.m. A blurry clip showed Linda stepping into her kitchen in a robe, pouring herself a glass of water. It wasn't enough to prove a crime had occurred, but it pointed to something sinister. Jason was brought in for questioning. Emily, confronted with what Jason had been hiding, finally broke down. The police retrieved the box and sent the contents for forensic analysis. Still, Linda remained missing. The pressure mounted as media attention grew. Local news stations camped outside the Bowers and Reyes homes. Reporters speculated on what had happened. 3 days after Jason's interrogation, a long-haul truck driver contacted police. He had dashcam footage from the night Linda vanished. Authorities rushed to the site. The dental records confirmed it was Linda Bowers. The discovery sent shockwaves through the town. Jason was arrested the same evening, charged with Linda's murder. Emily moved out the next morning. Mark refused to speak to reporters. What had begun as an attempt to escape boredom had become a twisted nightmare of surveillance, obsession, and death. The arrest of Jason Reyes sent tremors through every quiet street and cul-de-sac of the neighborhood. For days the air felt heavier, lawn chairs sat empty, curtains stayed drawn. What had once seemed like a friendly suburban community now carried the weight of something dark and unspoken. The crime wasn't just shocking, it was intimate. It had unfolded in their midst, hidden beneath smiles, cookouts, and polite conversation. And at its center stood a man whose obsession turned deadly. As news of Linda's body being found circulated, more disturbing details began to emerge from the ongoing investigation. Jason had descended into obsession. What started as a consensual, secretive arrangement had evolved into a warped fantasy in which he believed he could possess Linda. Reporters camped outside her temporary apartment, shouting questions through her windows. She had ignored Jason's red flags, his possessiveness, his spying, his mood swings. She turned over her phone, emails, and written journals. One entry, dated just 2 weeks before Linda's death, caught the investigators' attention. In it, Emily had written, "Jason keeps saying things like, 'If I can't have her, no one will.' He's not joking anymore. I see it in his face." Emily appeared under heavy guard, visibly thinner, her once vibrant energy drained. They played recordings of Linda's final days, showing her growing paranoia and discomfort. They introduced forensic evidence tying Jason to the burial site. They read from Emily's journals and text messages, showing the progression from consent to control to threat. Jason entered in a Navy prison jumpsuit, hands shackled, expression blank. He pleaded not guilty to the charges of first-degree murder, stalking, and unlawful surveillance. He's watching Linda like she's not even real, like she's already his. She had indulged in the twisted lifestyle, enjoyed the thrill, and never stopped to think how far it could go. A new family moved into the Reyes' former home. It wasn't just about infidelity. It was about what happens when boundaries are blurred, when obsession replaces affection, and when people believe they can control others without consequence. The Bowers house sat on the market for nearly a year before a young couple bought it. Mark visited every Sunday, always alone. He brought fresh flowers. He sat on the bench beside her stone. He never spoke out loud. He just stayed there for hours with nothing left to say. They repainted the walls, tore out the garden, and replaced the mailbox. But some neighbors said the house still felt cold inside, as if it hadn't forgiven what happened within its walls. They painted Jason as emotionally unstable but not a cold-blooded killer. They claimed he panicked, made poor choices, and never meant to hurt anyone. Now, one woman was dead, her husband shattered, and her own life in ruins. Her employer quietly placed her on leave. Friends stopped returning her messages. She had become infamous by association. She admitted her involvement in the group's private arrangement. Their connection had ended the moment Linda's life did. She described how Jason's obsession grew, how he began following Linda, recording her, and talking about her as if she belonged to him. Jason sat still, eyes fixed forward, as the judge sentenced him to life without the possibility of parole. He offered no reaction, no apology, just silence. She broke down when recounting the night she came home to find Jason burning Linda's perfume bottle in their backyard fire pit. When that fantasy began to crumble, he lashed out. It helped the prosecutors establish premeditation, which would become critical during trial. The hotel blanket in which she was wrapped came from a small roadside in about 20 minutes from the burial site. He stopped answering his phone, refused interview requests, and rarely left the house. His once pristine lawn grew over, packages piled on his porch. He left the lights off even at night. He had lost not only his wife but also his sense of self. His affair with Emily had begun as an escape from numbness, but now it felt like the spark that lit the fuse. He didn't blame Emily directly, but he knew they had all played a role in letting something reckless spiral into tragedy. The hotel's guest log showed a check-in under a false name, paid in cash on the very night Linda disappeared. Residents stopped waving to each other. Some sold their homes, others installed new locks and security systems. Children no longer rode bikes along the sidewalks. Trust had evaporated and suspicion lingered. Surveillance footage from the front desk caught Jason's unmistakable frame and profile, even with his cap pulled low. The timestamp matched the hours in question. Combined with the dashcam footage from the truck driver, the chain of events grew clearer and grimmer. Detectives built a timeline. Linda had returned home early from her hotel stay. Jason had followed her, likely aware of her movements thanks to his surveillance methods. There were bruises on her arms and wrists indicating a struggle. Dirt under her fingernails contained fragments of Jason's skin. The evidence was irrefutable. Something had occurred inside the house, perhaps a confrontation, perhaps an attempt to persuade her to be with him. When she refused, things turned violent. She was either killed in the house or subdued, transported to the rural location, and buried before sunrise. The robe fibers, the trace DNA, and the discovery of the blanket all tied Jason directly to the crime. Forensics confirmed what investigators feared. Linda had been strangled. But even with the facts laid bare, the motive remained layered. It wasn't just about jealousy or betrayal, it was about control. Emily, though never implicated in the crime, was pulled into the center of media frenzy. Behind closed doors, Emily wrestled with guilt. She agreed to fully cooperate with the prosecution. This statement, though not enough to prevent the crime, painted a haunting picture of Jason's mindset. Mark Bowers, devastated by Linda's death, withdrew from public life. The neighborhood, once filled with birthday parties, summer cookouts, and block cleanups, became quiet and cold. The trial was set to begin 4 months after Jason's arrest. The courtroom overflowed with reporters and spectators. Mark was there, hollow-eyed and silent. The prosecution laid out its case with brutal precision. They presented footage from Jason's surveillance cameras. Jason's defense tried to argue that the relationship was consensual and complicated, that Linda's death had been accidental during a heated argument. But the jury saw through it. When Emily took the stand, she testified for 3 hours. Her voice trembled, but she told the truth. Her testimony sealed the narrative that Jason had spiraled into dangerous delusion. After 9 days of testimony and 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a unanimous verdict. Guilty on all counts. Emily left the courtroom under escort, eyes red but dry. She didn't look at Mark. Mark didn't look at her. Months passed, and the story faded from headlines. The tragedy became a cautionary tale, a whispered warning told behind closed doors. Linda's grave, set in a quiet cemetery shaded by trees, became a place of quiet pilgrimage. The final chapter of the tragedy unfolded slowly, not in courtrooms or on the news, but in the quiet, everyday aftermath of lives that had been torn apart. Jason Reyes remained locked behind bars, his name now synonymous with obsession and betrayal in the minds of those who had once called him neighbor. But justice, while served, didn't offer closure for everyone. Though their relationship had grown distant over time, she had still been the person he had built decades with. They had shared a home, memories, children, and holidays. He had failed her in the most unthinkable way. He had allowed chaos into their home, allowed temptation to blind him, but now she questioned whether it had been love, or just a craving for security, validation, and escape from Jason's control. The dreams were brief and always ended the same way, with silence, then a door closing, and then nothing. She never saw Linda's face in those dreams, but she felt her presence, heavy and constant, like a shadow that followed her wherever she went. She had mistaken desire for stability and admiration for love. And her silence, her inaction when things began to spiral, had helped seal Linda's fate. Still, the file remained in storage, marked and flagged, collecting dust in the corner of the evidence archive. He brought Lila her favorite and sat for hours, unmoving, staring at the stone with her name etched deep into its surface. The cemetery was quiet that morning. A gentle breeze moved through the trees. He thought about speaking, but no words came. After everything that had happened, after all the betrayal and pain, what could he possibly say? And in doing so, left her vulnerable to something he never anticipated. Jason was locked away for life. Emily was not charged but remained forever tied to the case. And Mark had fallen into reclusive obscurity. It had been simple a movie, Chinese takeout, a brief argument about what to watch, and then falling asleep on the couch together. It was how many lives were quietly destroyed before the final blow was ever struck. The world had moved on, but Mark hadn't. He didn't know if he ever would. He thought about Linda's laugh. Not the fake one she used in public, but the real one, the one she let out when something truly caught her off guard. He missed that sound more than anything else in the world. True crime forums dissected it. YouTube documentaries told it in 10-minute segments. Podcasts debated who was most to blame. It was about how easily people lose themselves when they stop being honest about what they want, what they fear, and what they're willing to risk for the illusion of something more. But none of them captured the real truth. None of them saw the slow erosion, the emotional drift, the subtle shift from thrill to danger. He hadn't realized it at the time, but that was the last moment before their lives changed forever. That was the last moment of peace. But for one rookie officer who had worked the case early on, a few questions remained. The footage Jason had taken spanned months. Some of the recordings were still being processed even after the trial. One, recovered from a corrupted hard drive, was time-stamped weeks before the murder. In it, Jason could be heard speaking to someone in hushed tones. The other voice was harder to identify, but had similarities to Emily's. The conversation was vague, filled with half-statements and broken sentences, but the tone suggested a plan or at least a shared awareness of Jason's obsession. For those who had survived, the scars were deeper, more personal, and far less visible. Children played in driveways again, but under more watchful eyes. The guest bedroom remained empty for months. The upstairs bathroom, where Linda was last seen alive, had been remodeled entirely, down to the tiles and fixtures. And yet, even with fresh paint and modern furniture, something about the house resisted peace. Neighbors spoke, but with a slight hesitation. Everyone had been touched by what had happened. It was impossible to forget. A few families moved away, choosing to start over in places untouched by that dark history. The newcomers who bought the Bowers house knew about the tragedy. It was impossible not to, but the price had been right, and they believed in fresh starts. He wondered how many chances he'd had to stop it. She changed her last name, deleted her social media accounts, and cut off contact with nearly everyone from her past. Through a victims advocate program, she was referred to a therapist who specialized in trauma recovery. She began weekly sessions, talking through everything: her motivations, her blind spots, her shame. But no therapy session could fully untangle the consequences of what she had helped set in motion. The guilt didn't come in waves. It was constant, steady, and suffocating. Mark Bowers, once a man of structure and pride, drifted into a version of himself that barely resembled who he used to be. The house he once shared with Linda stood mostly dark, blinds always drawn, curtains thick enough to block out the world. He lived in routines that gave him the illusion of order morning coffee at 6 a.m., lawn watered at exactly 8:30, trash out by 7 o'clock on Mondays. But inside he was hollow. He had lost his wife, and with her, the only stable part of his life. The guilt was inescapable. He replayed everything, every dinner with Jason and Emily, every exchanged glance, every time he looked away when things became uncomfortable. Emily, after the trial, moved out of state. She had fallen in love with Mark, or at least she thought she had. From time to time, Emily still dreamed of Jason, not the man he was in the end, but the charming, ambitious one she first met. Back in the neighborhood, life slowly returned to a muted form of normalcy. The house itself had been cleaned, renovated, and redecorated, but certain rooms still held a strange, lingering cold. Detectives closed the file with a tidy bow, confident in the outcome. The clip was never publicly released. There wasn't enough to reopen anything, and even if there had been, the prosecution had already won their case without it. On the anniversary of Linda's death, Mark visited her grave again. He remembered the last normal night they'd shared before meeting Jason and Emily. As he sat by the grave, He thought not about the affair, not about the trial, or Jason, or even Emily. By the time he left, the sun had risen high. In the years that followed, the story of the older couple and the younger neighbors turned into an internet legend. It wasn't just about swapping partners or cheating wives. In the end, the tragedy wasn't just Linda's murder.